Hey there everyone, it's child therapist Mister Stu back again with another edition of what's really going on here, working to understand root causes of disruptive behaviors in children. Today's edition is all about disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, also known as DMDD. If you haven't ever heard of DMDD before, basically just imagine a roller coaster. Now imagine riding it every day, all day. Sounds thrilling, right? Well, that's what children with DMDD experience, an emotional roller coaster that never seems to stop. The highs are super high, the lows are really low, and the turns are wildly unpredictable. It's like living in a perpetual state of terrible twos, only it's amplified and extended well beyond those toddler years. DMDD is characterized mainly by severe and recurrent temper tantrums, outbursts that are like mini volcanic eruptions, way out of proportion to the situation that's actually happening. These aren't your run-of-the-mill tantrums. They're as frequent as reruns of your favorite sitcom, and it happens 3 or more times per week. In between those outbursts, kids with DMDD aren't exactly chilling on the beach sipping a juice box. They're persistently irritable or angry, almost daily, most of the day. You can think of it like a pot of water constantly on the brink of boiling over. So if you're dealing with DMDD, remember you're not alone in this roller coaster ride. And while it might be a wild ride, with professional help and a supportive environment, it can become less about the loops and dives and more about enjoying the view from the top. Buckle up and remember to enjoy the ride. Today we'll be talking about the neurotypical brain. If you haven't yet watched the video where I explain the neurotypical brain in detail, I encourage you to check that one out and then come back here so you have a shared vocabulary about the different parts of the brain. After that, we'll talk about the symptoms that make up DMDD and understand that just because a child throws tantrums does not mean they have DMDD. There's certain criteria that have to be met. Then we'll take a look at the brain function and neurochemistry of a child with DMDD and understand how the differences in brain function are the root cause of the difficult symptoms. Finally, I'll explain 3 different strategies you can use to support a child dealing with DMDD. Are you ready? Steady? Here we go! We'll start out talking about the neurotypical brain today. Let's just talk through the main pieces. And again, if you haven't checked out that video where I explain the neurotypical brain in detail, be sure to do that. Let's start with our model of the brain here. We'll talk first about the brain stem. Remember, this is the brain's autopilot. It regulates all of the things you don't have to think about: heart rate, breathing, circulation, digestion, things like that. Then there's the cerebellum. It's that balance. It has a lot to do with motor coordination and social interaction. The cerebellum, it's there in the back. Up here we've got the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe mainly deals with processing the sense of sight, vision. The parietal lobe is here. It deals with processing the sense of touch and taste. Then we've got the temporal lobe down here in the middle. It processes sound and smell. It also has a lot to do with memory. And then down here, divided between the brain stem and the temporal lobe, is the amygdala, the brain's alarm system that goes off anytime it senses danger. Then we've got our main neurotransmitters here. The first one is dopamine, that reward chemical, the one that makes you feel good whenever you've done something that you enjoy, something you get pleasure from. It's because of dopamine. Next, we've got serotonin. It is the body's comfort blanket, that weighted blanket that just helps keep everything under control. It regulates our sleep, our digestion, and our appetite. Then next we've got norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is like a steroid to the brain, and it causes stimulation in the brain. It especially affects the amygdala. Next, we've got gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA. It is a regulatory neurotransmitter that helps to slow things down. It's like a brake pedal. Then we've got glutamate. Glutamate helps form connections between different parts of the brain, makes them all talk to each other, and loves that connection. And finally, we've got cortisol, the brain's main stress chemical that is released anytime the brain is under pressure. If you are exposed to cortisol for too long, then you can have what's called chronic stress. That is the neurotypical brain. Again, if you haven't checked out the full video about the neurotypical brain, do that now and then come right back here. You can pick up right where you left off. But now let's talk about DMDD. Disruptive Mood Dysregulation Disorder. And when I'm explaining this disorder to children, I like to break it down. And so I take the 4 different words: disruptive, mood, dysregulation, disorder. And here's how I explain it. Disruptive means that it's causing some type of issue. It's disrupting something. A disruption means that something is going on and something else happens that draws attention away or just interrupts the original intended plan. A disruption. Then mood is your emotion, the way you feel overall. And so when you put those 2 pieces together, there's something that is interrupting your mood. And that leads to dysregulation. Dysregulation, it means that you can't control it. So you've got this mood that is feeling out of control because you don't feel like you can control it. So you've got a disruptive mood, a mood that's causing you turmoil and you can't control it. And disorder means that it's causing you a problem. So when you take those 4 words and put it all together, it's a disruptive mood, an emotion or a way you're feeling that just doesn't feel right. You feel this big, tough emotion and it feels out of control and it causes you problems, and you feel that way most of the time. That is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder in general. But there are specific criteria that the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that book that therapists and other mental health clinicians use to diagnose people with different disorders, that book has certain criteria that have to be met. And so it's not just having a tantrum or feeling off or feeling angry or arguing. Those things alone don't mean that a child can be diagnosed with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Here are the actual symptoms and the frequency and intensity they have to be met at in order for a child to be diagnosed with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Here they are: severe recurrent temper outbursts manifested verbally and or behaviorally that are grossly out of proportion in intensity or duration to the situation or provocation. These outbursts can be expressed as verbal rages or physical aggression towards people or property. The outbursts are inconsistent with the child's developmental level. That's important here because you could have a teenager that's at a much younger developmental level, so it may be more likely that they will have tantrums, and those would be developmentally appropriate at their developmental level. But basically, that first criteria says that there have to be frequent temper tantrums that come out either verbally or behaviorally, and they have to be out of proportion to what happened to them. If they're facing giant things that should cause them to feel very upset, then this doesn't quite fit. This is when a child doesn't get a packet of ketchup, and so they throw themselves on the ground and start banging their fists and maybe start punching walls, different things like that. It's where something very small sets off a very large explosion. Just like I said at the beginning, it's like that pot of water that's always about to boil over, and when it boils over big like a volcano. Also, the mood between outbursts is persistently irritable or angry most of the day, nearly every day, and is observable by others. This persistent irritability can impact the child's performance at school, relationships with peers, and family interactions. So it's not just, oh, they have an attitude. It is, you can tell that they are persistently irritable or angry almost all of the day, almost every day. And most other people, when they view the behavior of the child, they also agree that that child seems persistently irritable or angry. Those temper tantrums and the persistently irritable mood have to be present in at least 2 of 3 settings, meaning things like home or school or when they're out with peers. It has to be in at least 2 places. It can't just be that they only feel this way at school. If they only feel that way at school, there's something going on at school. If they only feel that way at home, there's something going on at home. If they only feel that way around friends, there's something going on around their friends. But if they feel that way in multiple environments, then this would fit. Also, those 2 criteria, the temper tantrums and the persistently irritable mood, they have to have been present for at least 12 months with no period of 3 months or more where that wasn't happening. What that ensures is it could just be that there were several things that happened over the course of a year, but if there's a break for longer than 3 months, then it wouldn't be disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. You have to have seen these symptoms for at least a year consistently. So to put it all together, a child can be diagnosed with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder if they have been having severe temper tantrums at least 3 times a week that are grossly out of proportion to the trigger. In between those temper tantrums, they show a persistently irritable mood. That persistently irritable mood is nearly every day for almost all of the day, and those things have to be taking place in at least 2 different settings, like at home, at school, or with their friends, and it has to have gone on for at least a year, and the child has to be at least 6, can't be over 18, and this has to have been noticed at age 10 or younger. That is disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. It's not just temper tantrums. It's not just having an out of control mood. It's not feeling bipolar. It is all of those criteria that have to be met in order for this to be the thing that you're dealing with. Now that we know all those criteria, let's see what the brain with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder looks like. What is it that causes all of these symptoms, those severe temper tantrums and the irritable mood for most of the time, just all day, every day? What is it that causes that to happen? Let's check it out. This is the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. You can see that there are several differences between this brain and the neurotypical brain, and I'm going to go through each of those in detail now. Let's talk first about the neurotransmitters, because those have a lot to do with the brain function. So if we can understand those, then the brain function will automatically make a little more sense. First, dopamine in the brain of a child with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder looks a whole lot like this. It's kind of like sometimes dopamine hits the mark and sometimes it doesn't. These are the children who maybe you used a behavioral strategy for a while and it worked and it kind of was hit or miss, and then they really got into it and now it's just not seeming to work, and it seems like their reward system just fluctuates. One day they really like something, the next day they absolutely hate it. And while there's some of that that's predictable in children and that would be typical in children, these children oftentimes have that be a lot of their experience. Just a lot of hot and cold feelings towards things. I love it, then I hate it. I love this person, then I don't want to ever see them ever again. And it goes back and forth. Why? Because this dopamine, the receptors in the brain that process dopamine and the amount of dopamine in the brain is hit or miss. Sometimes it can be rewarded greatly by an activity, and the next time it kind of misses the mark. And so dopamine doesn't function at its optimum capabilities in the brain of a child with DMDD. Then there's also this reduction in the chemical serotonin in the brain. And if you remember, serotonin is like the body's weighted blanket. It helps regulate things like mood and appetite and sleep. It would make sense that these children's moods feel out of control because the chemical in their brain that helps them keep their emotions under control is depleted. It makes total sense that they have difficulty regulating their emotions because they don't have the amount of this regulating chemical that they need in order to be able to calm their emotions down every single time right away. Now, with practice and with therapy and sometimes with medication, children can learn to still regulate their emotions with that depleted serotonin level, or with medication, sometimes you can boost the serotonin level in the brain and help the child regulate those different emotions. And finally, in these children's brains, the neurotransmitter glutamate is at an increased level. That means that the brain has some overexcitement and some dysregulation. If you remember, glutamate is the chemical that helps all the different pieces of the brain talk to each other, but an overabundance of glutamate can make it feel like chaos inside of the brain. So putting all that together, that reward chemical, dopamine, is hit or miss. Sometimes it feels good, sometimes it doesn't so much. There's a decreased amount of serotonin in the brain, which is the brain's weighted blanket that helps regulate things like emotion. And finally, there's an increased amount of glutamate, which causes overexcitement in the brain and some dysregulation because it's a bit chaotic. Now let's talk about the different lobes of the brain and how those are impacted in DMDD because of those neurotransmitter differences. The brainstem function in children with DMDD is actually fairly typical. The same is true for their cerebellum. Things start to get a little wild when you look at the amygdala. If you remember, the amygdala is the body's alarm system. And in the children with DMDD, their alarm system, their amygdala, is hyperactive because they have an increased amount of glutamate, a decreased amount of serotonin that would help to regulate this amygdala. That means that these children's alarm systems go off randomly. That's why it could seem like a very small trigger that gets a very large response, because these children's amygdalas are hyperactive. That glutamate causes hyperactivity in the amygdala, and serotonin is decreased, so it can't calm down the amygdala. So these children's alarm system is on a hairpin trigger where the smallest thing will set it off into a big explosion of behaviors. Then you can see that for the most part, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe are fairly similar to the neurotypical brain until we get to this middle part here. That is because the temporal lobe also helps us as we process all of these senses and put these things together. It helps us to process emotions in ourselves and in others. And children with DMDD have a decreased ability to even identify their emotions or identify the emotions in others. These children can seem like they have a lack of empathy for anyone, but really it's just that they don't quite understand emotions just yet. Their brain hasn't helped them to learn what anger looks like, what sadness looks like. And for these children, it can be very difficult to connect with others socially. What could be a child acting happy might not appear that way to a child with DMDD. Or if a child with DMDD does something and a child is sad as a result, they may not notice that their behavior led to some of this outcome. And so for children with DMDD, it can almost seem like they don't care about others, but that's not the case. They just need a little more help to understand how they are feeling, how others are feeling, and how what they do has an impact on how others are feeling. So keep that in mind when you're working with children with DMDD. It's not that they don't care. It's literally that their brain can't quite understand just yet. And finally, you can see that the prefrontal cortex, that area right behind the forehead in the brain that helps with logic and reasoning, that part of the brain is diminished. In the neurotypical brain, it shines bright like a light bulb. In children with DMDD, it's more like a candle. That can be why children seemingly overreact, because that part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, is already not developed too well until about the age of 12. So if they're under that age, it's already not developed. Then diminish that even more, and so it can seem like their behaviors are grossly out of proportion. And it can seem like, how could anyone think that that was an appropriate response to whatever happened? And here's the thing, nobody does believe and think that that was an appropriate response. It's that that thought part of the brain isn't functioning at its optimal level. So again, it's not that these children don't care, and it's not that they did these things for absolutely no reason. They may just not be able to connect the way that they feel with the way that they reacted, what they chose to do as a result of the emotion that they were feeling, because that part of the brain is diminished and they have difficulty understanding emotions in themselves and others. When you put all that together, it's pretty easy to understand why children with DMDD would have severe and recurrent temper outbursts frequently, and they would have a persistent and irritable mood. Why? Because all of these neurotransmitters, these chemicals in the brain, and the function of the brain are affected and different in these children. And so there have to be specific supports that can help to support the child as they deal with this suboptimal brain functionality. It can be regulated, it can be managed. It's just that these children need supports because their brains are functioning differently. That doesn't always mean that these children require medication. It just means they need empathy, understanding, some patience, and some specific supports can really be beneficial. Let me tell you about some of those. First is mindful breathing techniques. It's not just about taking a deep breath, it's about taking a mindful breath, a paced breath, a breath with intention. And when you think of it that way, that can help you understand what I'm really talking about here. The reason that that works is because when we feel chaotic in our minds, one of the things that starts to happen is our breathing gets shallow because it's preparing us to fight or flee, our fight or flight response. And when you slow down your breathing, when you pace your breathing, when you have mindful breathing, then what you're triggering your brain to realize is, I'm not in a situation where I need fast breathing. I'm in a situation where I can take calm breaths. And I know that it seems chaotic, but I can take calm breaths. And so if I can take calm breaths, it must not be too bad. This can be very helpful for children who have those severe recurrent temper tantrums, to help them learn that they can calm themselves down if they'll calm down their breathing. Here's the trick though. You can't just bark at a tantruming child to take some deep breaths. You have to practice these breaths when the child is not upset. I've seen some great ways to help children understand this. One of my favorites is the finger breaths, where you have a child breathe in while they're tracing up their finger or up your finger, and breathe out through their mouth as they move down your finger. So it would be like, I've also seen some clients whose parents hold up their hands like this, and the child pretends to blow out birthday candles as the parent puts down a finger. And that also allows for the parent to coach the child to say, hey, a little bit slower. Oh, breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And it allows that co-regulation at the same time. It also really helps if you will take those deep breaths too, not just yelling at your child or the child in your care to calm down and take deep breaths, but if you come over and help them, even if they're frustrated with you, maybe you keep your distance, but you say, you know what, let's take some deep breaths together so that we can get through this. I know you're upset. I can tell that you're feeling angry, but we can do this together. Let's take some deep breaths together. And you can have them either trace your hand, or you trace their hand, or they trace their hand, or however you want it to be, or you blow out the birthday candles, or maybe they can just take those mindful breaths on their own. But it helps trigger the brain to see this is not a situation that requires this large of a response. Next is just creating a consistent routine. That can mean that you have the same steps that you go through every morning, and you wake your child up at the same time every day. Maybe they get home from school and there's an after-school routine. And if you can provide that consistent routine, what that does is it helps a child have a predictable environment. Remember that their amygdala is already hyperactive, and the amygdala gets triggered anytime there's something that seems dangerous, and to the brain, what seems dangerous is things that are not in a pattern. So if you can provide a predictable pattern to the child's day, then their amygdala will be able to be more regulated. Remember, their serotonin is depleted, so they need a little more help. So if you can keep that consistent routine, it will help decrease the reactivity of the amygdala, also help them feel more comfortable in their environment, which allows that depleted amount of serotonin to do other things rather than have to be dealing with the unpredictability of the schedule. And finally, these children can greatly benefit from regular physical activity. And when I say physical, I mean heart pumping, breath breathing, sweat dripping activity. The reason that this works is that it helps the body to see what it's like to be under pressure. It also can help increase the amount of serotonin in the brain, and regular physical activity also helps provide dopamine in the brain. And this regular physical activity can burn off some of that excess glutamate that's causing the hyperactivity in the brain. Overall, regular physical activity is huge for children dealing with DMDD. It helps with all of the neurotransmitter imbalances, and it helps them remain more regulated. I was also saying that it helps the brain to understand, here's what feeling under stress actually feels like. Here's the situations when I actually need to breathe more hard. Here's the situations where I actually need to breathe harder, where I actually need to make the heart beat faster because the body is under stress. And it helps those times when the child is not under that much stress to be a little more baseline and predictable, because their body understands this is not a time when I'm feeling all that pressure, all that stress on me. That is when I'm doing the regular physical activity. Now, the key to this is making it something that's fun for the child. Some children do want to take some workout bands, and that is just a blast for them, and they can run around and they can just do this all on their own. Some children need a little more guidance. Playgrounds are amazing. Getting children enrolled in physical sports like soccer, where it doesn't really matter if you are good at all. You are going to be running up and down the field and trying to kick a ball, and you are going to be breathing hard and sweating, and your heart is going to be beating. Those types of things that just get children moving and having fun is the best type of activity to recommend to a child with DMDD. Those activities will help stimulate dopamine in the brain, stimulate serotonin in the brain, burn off the excess glutamate, help the brain understand what stress really feels like, and it is the best. So if you have a child who is struggling with DMDD, make sure they are getting regular physical activity. DMDD is pretty complex. But when you break it down, it's all about just not really understanding what your emotions are and what to do about them. So even just some conversation with children about their emotions is so helpful. If you need some help starting those conversations, make sure to check out MisterStuTV on YouTube. It's youtube.com/@MisterStuTV. You're probably watching this video on MisterStuTV Parents on YouTube. If you're not, head over there now. It's youtube.com/@MisterStuTV Parents. Check out both of those channels. The children's channel can help you to start conversations with children about different emotions and how to respond to those different emotions. And the Parents channel has lots of mental health tips, tricks, and resources for you and the children in your lives. You've got this. Implement some strategies and give some empathy. If you'll do that, then you'll be building a stronger bond with your child even as they struggle with DMDD, and you'll be setting them up for success because they will see that there's somebody who cares about them even when there's some tough times going on. I'll be back again next time. Until then, spread the word and share the love. Bye-bye.